Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees.
Episode 142, The Mining Murderer. Frank Butler was possibly Australia's first serial killer. This is one of those rare events where, despite aliases, I am unable to definitively say what this man's name was at his birth. There are several theories. Some sources say that he was born Richard Ashe in Dorset, England in 1858, although some sources say that his birth name was John Newman. There were later reports in papers that said that his real name may have been Elgin. He adopted numerous aliases as he travelled around the world, arriving in Australia in the early 1890s. In and out of prison, on and off the goldfields, Ashe found himself in Sydney in mid-1896 under the name of Frank Butler Harwood. Butler placed advertisements in Sydney newspapers under the name Harwood, seeking men to accompany him to the search for gold. He was labelled the al fresco murderer by the Bulletin. Butler took these men west, told grand stories of mines worth thousands of pounds. He made their companions dig their own graves, telling them they were digging for gold, before he shot them, robbed them, buried them, and then moved on. Butler's known victims, all recruited in Sydney, were Charles Burgess, Arthur Preston, and Lee Weller. Butler certainly fills the common criteria of the serial killer. He murdered at least 3 men, with a clear interval between each murder. He killed each man alone. The pattern of murder, conning men into digging their own graves, shooting them, and then having a very deliberate modus operandi, while his signature of leaving men in their shallow, unmarked graves is consistent across all 3 victims as well. Frank Butler certainly has some similarities to Frederick Deeming, who I did an episode on, episode 90. Frederick Deeming was also one that served on ships. This was the way that he crisscrossed around the globe and perpetrated his crimes. So I'm now going to backtrack and present the information based on what was gleaned when Frank Butler was tried at the court in Sydney. The first authentic trace of Butler was supplied by James Murphy of San Francisco, who identified him as Richard Ashe of the HMS Liffey. He deserted either from the warships Pelican or Triumph and joined the Liffey in 1882 when he was 24. Murphy stated that Butler came from the west of Dorset. John Conway of San Francisco alleged that Butler was transferred from the HMS Duke of Wellington to the HMS Sultan in the beginning of 1882, going to Gibraltar and then Malta, and that he was at the bombardment of Alexandria. 4 months later, he returned to England. Conway next saw Butler in Coquimbo in 1886 and next in the city prison at San Francisco. Butler afterwards proceeded to Canada, where he entered the Mounted Police. He next enlisted in the US Army as James McKnight and deserted in September 1886. Next, he enlisted as George Anderson in February 1887 and deserted in May, proceeding to San Francisco, where he shipped for England in a vessel called the Begluther. He went to Holyhead, and the next move was shipping as Richard Ashe on the ship Ulidia, bound for Sydney, in which city he left in the Star of Russia as Ashe and arrived in San Francisco in August 1891. Next, Butler was employed as a policeman at La Grande Laundry till February 1892. In the following month, he returned to England on the ship the Scottish Glen and made his way thence to Olivebank to Newcastle, New South Wales. In the last named port, he was served a month's jail for threatening the life of his captain and his crew. He was sentenced as Frank Butler, with time in Maitland Jail, after his shipmates refused to cough up a 10-bail surety. When he was released from Maitland Jail in 1893, he immediately left Newcastle for Fremantle and the Western Australian goldfields. He went to Coolgardie, Western Australia. There he was seized with fever, and upon his recovery proceeded to Fremantle, where he spent or lost all of his money and had to walk back 300 miles to the goldfields to resume work. He got to a little place called Northam, and he offered to sell to a traveller who wanted to buy horses, one of three, which he saw in a paddock. The man gave him £40 for the animal, and he handed him a receipt for the amount signed Richard Ash. The theft of the horse was reported to the police, and he was tracked for 12 days, finally arrested and sent to Fremantle, where he was charged with horse stealing. On the 28th of August 1893, as Ash, he was convicted of unlawful possession in Newcastle, Western Australia, and sentenced to 6 months in jail. Newcastle's now called 2J. He must have been released as early as the 8th of February 1894, as he faced a similar charge again in Newcastle, Western Australia, and was sentenced to 6 months, this time with hard labour. On his release from Fremantle Jail, he travelled to Northam again, where he was suspected of stealing from miners. His tent was searched and items were found, and on the 1st of September 1894 he was again sentenced, this time to 18 months hard labour. After being released, he told the West Australian Police that he tried to join the bark Thyatira at Fremantle but failed, the reason being that the certificate which he had was a stolen one. His later boasts of having made a flash fortune were undercut by the reality that he had 5 incarcerations over 2 years. In the spring of 1895, he robbed a metallurgist called Frank Harwood of his professional qualifications and work papers. On his release in January 1896, he travelled to Coolgardie. In May 1896, Butler was a blacksmith at Coolgardie under the name of Frank Harwood. He then went mining and was there in August 1896 and then travelled to Sydney. Harwood was well known in Western Australia, so Butler headed back east so he could have a new scam to exploit using Harwood's work history. He went back to Sydney on September the 26th and there entered into an agreement with a man named McIver to go prospecting to Braidwood. But McIver had fallen out with Butler and abandoned him, and Butler again returned to Sydney. In October of the same year, he was in Sydney and told Albert Emity, who had known him in Western Australia, that he had been prospecting in the Albury district with another man and he had sold out for £2,000. Fred Horton of Tamworth stated that he was mining at John Bull with a man named Butler who wanted a mate to go prospecting. They proceeded to Glen Innes and prospected together for 4 months. Placing a notice in the Sydney Herald, he offered equal shares in prospecting trips into Western New South Wales. His newspaper ads proved a bit hit and miss. However, when Butler did receive a bite, the urgency with which he demanded a cash payment up front turned off those with any basic business nous. He eventually signed up a naive and socially reticent young man called Charles Burgess, after Butler dazzled him with a few gold teeth fillings as proof of an untapped gold reef that was waiting to be plundered. The pair headed west towards Parkes in Burgess's red-wheeled wagonette, and they set up camp on the Bogan River. One local passerby would later recall receiving a mouthful after criticising Butler's panning technique. After about a week, Butler arrived back in town fuming that his young partner had run off with his money and the gold they found. Butler sold the wagonette for £15 along with clothing and camping gear that Burgess had apparently left behind in his haste. In reality, Burgess was lying in a shallow bush grave not far from the river camp. There was a rifle bullet through the back of his head. The pattern of the wound suggested that he was shot at close range. Early in the November, he started out once more, this time for the Black Range, in company with a man named McCarthy, who, however, had eventually concluded that Butler was an imposter. His tools not being of a practical man, and his manner generally being suspicious. So suspicious that McCarthy thought it better to sleep in a house while Butler remained in the tent. Eventually, McCarthy had managed to get away. Butler returned to Sydney, where his Harwood scam continued to fall flat. Growing slowly poorer, reluctantly joined a team of miners in Grafton. When one of the group dug out a substantial gold nugget, Butler suggested they keep it quiet and split it 50-50. He was sent packing back to Sydney, where a young Irishman called Michael Conroy answered the ad. He was keen on seeing his adopted country whilst awaiting entry into the New South Wales Police Force. His first impression of Frank Harwood was that he was unable to answer a straight question, and Conroy never followed up on their meeting. On about the 17th of October 1896, Arthur T.O. Preston, 20 years old and a student at Sydney University, a young geology student, his first time away from a small country town, and he had a fiercely religious father. Answered an ad in the paper and met a man called Frank Harwood at the railway dining rooms in George Street, Sydney. They then caught a train to Emu Plains at the foot of the Blue Mountains, and on the train they spoke to a Mr. Thompson, who reported that they planned to go to Glenbrook. A few days later, Thompson saw Harwood in Sydney and asked where Preston was. Harwood advised that Preston was no use in the bush and he was taking another man with him instead. Like Burgess, Arthur Preston's relationship with Butler would end in a shallow grave, a rifle bullet passing through his brain and out his nose. He was wrapped in a red and white striped towel, spotted purple with his blood. Both Charles Burgess and Arthur Preston were barely missed at first, having told friends that they were heading into the bush for at least 6 weeks. On the 29th of October 1896, a retired sea captain, Lee E. Weller, who lived in Phillip Street, Sydney, in answer to an ad, went prospecting with Frank Butler. The 38-year-old Weller had been at sea since boyhood and worked up to the rank of master mariner. Failing eyesight meant it forced him into early retirement. In 1896, he left England to start a new life after marriage to a London music hall singer. They tried Boston and Johannesburg before settling in Australia. During their Johannesburg to Newcastle leg, Mrs. Weller fell sick and suffered a fatal heart attack as the ship reached Newcastle. A distraught Weller headed to Sydney and drank his anguish down in an alcoholic bender, which is at this time he met Frank Butler. His empathetic new friend shared his own tales of deep loss and convinced the grieving widow he had an antidote to his bitterness and grief, a prospecting trip into the wilderness. It is a wild, free, open life, Lee Weller enthused to his solicitor in a letter before setting off into the Blue Mountains hinterland with Butler. They caught the train from Redfern to Glenbrook. The plan was to look at the creeks in this area for gold. They pitched camp at Glenbrook, and Weller was last seen on the 31st of October 1896. When a friend of Weller's turned up at the Blue Mountains to check on his friend's health, he found his accommodation ransacked. This triggered a police search of the Glenbrook area, which became more urgent after Arthur Burgess's body was found in nearby Lyndon, and the police found a clear link between both men and Frank Butler/Harwood. By late November 1896, a syndicated paper published news of a concerted police manhunt. Butler, Captain Weller's mate, is described as being 40 to 44 years of age, 5'10", a native of Shropshire, England, medium build, sunburnt complexion. His features bear a hard, weather-beaten appearance, dark hair turning grey, dark moustache tinged with grey, and a deformity of the nose. When last seen, he was dressed as a bushman and carrying a pick, shovel and Winchester rifle. The man had in his possession a large quantity of gold specimens and valuable gold and diamond jewellery, as well as the papers of the name Frank Harwood. It went on to show that the rightful Harwood had been employed some time ago at the Broken Hill proprietary mine. Following up a clue obtained, the detectives ascertained that Butler had more than once advertised for partners to go prospecting in the country, and a somewhat similar notification, believed to have emanated from Butler, appeared in the daily papers, but not recently, since Weller disappeared. Search parties narrowed the search for Weller to dense bush around Glenbrook. An expired campfire was found with Weller's coat, remnants of his notebook, a pair of trousers, leggings and a coat with the name Butler discarded around it. On the 6th of December 1896, in a gully under an overhanging rock, Captain Lee Weller's grave was found. His uncovered corpse was in a kneeling position. Like Burgess, his hat had been tossed back in next to him. A coat was also loose in the grave. The trousers were on the body. A close friend would later describe Weller as an active, genial, open-hearted fellow, thick-set and strong as a lion. The man who attacked him would have had a bad time if he had not taken the captain unawares. Witnesses later claimed hearing 2 gunshots echo out around 4 a.m. on the morning Weller was murdered. It would be almost 5 weeks to the day before his body was found. It was time enough for Frank Butler to make his way to Newcastle, cleaning out Weller's room of money, papers, books, guns, Mrs. Weller's jewellery, clothing, a railway station cloakroom ticket for a sea chest. He kept Weller's papers and jewellery after selling everything else to a local second-hand dealer. While imminent departure from Newcastle gave Butler licence to recklessly carry on in the town, the chance of playing at being a master mariner proved too thrilling an opportunity. He paid for one last Frank Harwood advertisement in the Newcastle Herald. Metallurgist wants agreeable mate, prospecting, mining experience unnecessary, equal shares. Detective McCaddy had watched Captain Lee Weller sauntering around town in a new suit and fine shoes the day before he sailed. When news came through on a wire from Glenbrook, McCaddy had just taken possession of a photograph given to a local girl frequently known to be in liquor. The back of the portrait was signed Butler, but the man had claimed to be Captain Lee Weller. Sensing his luck was about to run out, Butler, using Weller's identity, secured a passage to San Francisco by taking a job as a seaman on the Swanhilda on the 15th of November 1896. Butler handed over Captain Weller's papers to Charles Booth, the manager of the Harbourside Sailors' Home, who was also an agent for shipping companies seeking crews. Butler told Booth he was looking for a San Francisco coal run as general crew. He needed a break from the responsibilities of being captain. Butler had unnerved Booth with constant interruptions and commentary on life as a sea captain, all the while flashing cash and jewellery as if trying to impress the manager. This made Booth question why a cashed-up master captain would choose to be just general crew. Over the following days, while waiting, Butler played up the captain role in boarding houses and local hotels. He boasted of exploits and bravery, constantly and ostentatiously fiddling with the fine gold watch on a chain. He made much of various female trinkets that he owned, including rings, ornaments, bangles and bracelets. Later that same day, Captain Petrie of the trading bark Olive Bank recognised him in passing as Frank Butler, a troublemaker on a voyage from San Francisco to Newcastle 2 years previously. Petrie told local agents to keep him away from his ship. Butler's behaviour brought him to the attention of Detective James McHattie, who was at the time investigating a string of East End house robberies possibly connected with visiting sailors. Just as Detective McHattie was gathering some increasingly contradictory information on Captain Lee Weller, Butler went on board the Swanhilda and kept a low profile. Crewmates found him diligent but aloof, often wearing a black felt cap, conspicuously covering his eyes. There was an issue of a warrant for the arrest of Frank Harwood, alias S. Burgess, alias Butler, alias Simpson, alias Clare, alias Lee Weller. After about a fortnight at sea, the Swanhilda was stopped by a passing steamer who informed Captain Fraser and his first mate, Captain Lee Weller's body had been found in a shallow grave in the Blue Mountains bush with a bullet through the back of his skull. The man assuming his identity on their ship was thought to be Frank Butler, who police suspected of the murder. Captain Fraser was persuaded to continue on to San Francisco without alerting anyone on board of this revelation. Frank Butler remained perfectly unaware that he was at the centre of a global manhunt and murder investigation, and his multiple identities were finally converging on themselves. A plan was devised to beat the Swanhilda to San Francisco. Detective McHattie was selected along with Superintendent Inspector John Roach from Sydney and Constable Conroy, the young Irishman who had declined Butler's earlier digging invitation in Sydney. The police trio set out on a coordinated global journey, beginning with a steamship sprint via Sydney, London and New York, and then a locomotive across the American continent to San Francisco. In the end, Roach, McHattie and Conroy made it to San Francisco with days to spare. On the morning of the 21st of February 1897, they boarded the Swanhilda in the harbour, where Conroy identified Butler, who after a brief silence told them, "You're making a hell of a fuss about nothing. I am Lee Weller." After gathering Weller's portmanteau, which Butler admitted was his property, Butler would not go ashore without his soft black felt hat, which he dropped on the deck. Conway duly retrieved it and turned it down over Butler's eyes as requested. Detective McHattie and Constable Conroy searched the boat, found articles of jewellery belonging to Weller, a diploma in the name of Harwood, a jacket belonging to Preston, and he was wearing Lee Weller's boots. He claimed to have not known Weller, despite using his name and having some of his possessions. It was also reported that he had packets of strychnine powders in his possession. Arresting Butler on the water assured his arrest in New South Wales, even though it would be processed on American soil. At the office of the Chief of Police at New City Hall, Butler was further searched and questioned. The portmanteau produced incriminating papers, a chequebook in the name of Lee Weller, a bookstand of music, and articles of jewellery in a box, including 2 bangles, a brooch, 2 rings, a mail chain, and a locket. Butler initially dismissed a framed photograph of Mrs. Lee Weller as a photo of a lady friend, before revising it to be a photo of my recently deceased wife. A revolver and cartridges recovered on the Swanhilda were also marked in as evidence. Most of the items would prove to be the property of Lee Weller or Arthur Burgess. His black hat was a must-see in the San Francisco shopfront display in the weeks awaiting his extradition, people paid to pass him in his holding cell. Butler gave interviews that were rambling and irrationally self-absorbed, with contradictory accounts of his comings and goings and his guilt and innocence. While in custody in San Francisco, Butler claimed that Weller accidentally shot himself. Butler then claimed that he was forced to accept Weller's belongings. He then claimed he was Weller, so could not have murdered himself. He also claimed he was in the British Army serving in Zulu and Egyptian wars. Alone in his cell, he read back his words, written down and published in ink. He looked forward to clearing his name back in Australia, if only to confirm that Captain Lee Weller had committed suicide and taken on his identity was an act of respect to a good friend. Alone in his cell and away from the public, Butler's plans oscillated between mock silence and violent cunning. He attempted physical assaults on his jailers, and he hoped to be tried under San Francisco's more lenient criminal laws to avoid extradition and possible hanging in Australia. On the 9th of February 1897, during the extradition process, Butler admitted his real name was Richard Ashe. On the 27th of February 1897, Butler was approved for extradition back to Sydney, and at this time a reporter from the Francisco Examiner ascertained from Butler that his real name was John Newman and he was born in West Bromwich, England. Butler was released into the custody of Roach, McHattie and Conroy on the 3rd of April, when apparently realising that all hope was gone and fearing to face his trial in Sydney, he attempted suicide by opening a vein in his forehead with his thumbnail. After a huge fight put up by Butler's American lawyers, he was sent back to Sydney to face trial. The New South Wales government received a bill from the American authorities for £6,000 to cover the cost of Butler's US-based incarceration and legal fees. After some disputes, the colony eventually reduced the claim to £4,418. Butler was locked in a secure cabin for the voyage back to Sydney, and Butler commenced a hunger strike. Butler morphed into being solemn and evangelistic, forever chiding passers-by about damnation and the 7 deadly sins. On his voyage bound for Sydney on the SS Mariposa, he informed one of the policemen who were accompanying him that he shot Preston in self-defence and buried his body as he was frightened. He again claimed that Weller shot himself, this time in the act of suicide, as he was distraught over the death of his wife. The trial of Frank Butler for the murder of Lee Weller, the strongest case, commenced at Darlinghurst Courthouse on the 14th of June 1897. The court was overrun and those who turned up to watch were not disappointed. The proceedings were spectacular. There were numerous witnesses and a stunning array of evidence, including photographs of the crime scene at Glenbrook, clothing of the victim, a knife and a rifle, as well as personal items belonging to Weller. There were also reenactments. One of the police officers testifying was asked to lay on the floor of the courtroom and show the jury the position that Weller was found in. Even more dramatically, there was a demonstration for the jury, at the request of Butler's defence, showing the pistol in different positions to determine if it was possible that Weller had shot himself in the back of the head. There were attempts to control the crowds, there were delays, and there was also on one occasion when the prisoner was led through the tunnel that connected the jail to the courthouse, and there was a violent scuffle. After losing his fight with police, Butler appeared in court. His coat was buttoned up high and tight to cover up a self-inflicted injury. On Wednesday the 16th of June 1897, Butler attempted to kill himself before the court started. He tried to use the sharp point of a tobacco tin to cut his throat, but the cut was vertical and shallow. There was another delay when Butler collapsed in the dock. Butler's trial and sentencing proved relatively straightforward, even if he was erratic, disruptive and belligerent in his behaviour. His increasingly contradictory and unlikely responses to questions reinforced his guilt. The Chief Justice summed up the evidence and the jury retired. An hour and 20 minutes later, the jury returned with the verdict of guilty and the Chief Justice gave Butler a death sentence. McHattie described Frank Butler's case as being one of the most mundane. He said Butler was an average conman that turned into a lunatic murderer who believed in the reality of his fantasies. McHattie saw his killings as cowardly and opportunistic. He remembered Butler as a repulsive-looking man at the time of his arrest, and he said possibly before he had his nose broken and crime stamped his features, with an effaceable expression that caused many people to shrink from him, he may have had some kind of masculine attractiveness. A guilty verdict was inevitable and the death sentence was carried out on the 16th of July 1897 in Darlinghurst Jail. Robert Howard, Nosy Bob, from episode 133, was in attendance, as he had been for decades. In the West Australian in Perth on the 17th of July 1897, it reported the execution of Butler. Frank Butler, the murderer of Lee Weller at Glenbrook, was hung in Darlinghurst Jail at 9 o'clock this morning. Butler, who made such an exhibition of himself during the last day of the trial, nerved himself wonderfully at the end and gave himself up wholly to the ministrations of the clergy. Reverend Lane was in attendance at 7:30 and remained exhorting and praying with Butler till he was handed over by the governor of the jail to the sheriff, and not until the last moment when the ministration ceased. When the officials entered Butler's cell, he expressed himself as being quite ready and hoped that the business would be done as expeditiously as possible. He was terribly pale as the procession left the condemned cell, but that was all. Supported by 2 warders, he walked erect and took his place on the drop with a step that did not betray the slightest sign of weakness. He was leg-ironed, and on the gallows a pair of straps were substituted. When the irons were taken off, Butler allowed his gaze to wander at will over the knot of spectators in front of the gallows. The condemned man seemed to be the least concerned of all. He gave no trouble whatsoever to the executioner, held his arms in the proper position for the hangman to bind him. He stood up immediately to the executioner, entered his cell and remarked as Howard began the preparatory work, "Don't keep me long." Just before the cap was adjusted, Butler was asked if he had anything to say, and he replied that he had nothing to add to what had already been stated to the authorities, and then exclaimed, "Let her go." The drop immediately fell. Death must have been instantaneous, as not a muscle moved, and as the body swung suspended, all that was observed was a little streak of blood. As those who witnessed the execution left the jail gate, they were eagerly questioned by a small knot of people who had collected outside as to the manner in which the murderer met his death, and surprise was felt at the coolness he displayed, the opinion being generally held that he would collapse during the final moment at the scaffold. Immediately after the execution, Mr. Herbert, the governor of the jail, made a statement. "Yesterday Butler called me into his cell and said that he was guilty of the murders of Lee Weller, Preston and Burgess, and that the sentence passed upon him was a just one. He was quite satisfied with the treatment he'd received in jail and said that everybody had been very kind. He said the same to Reverend Lane, with the addition that he had been a very bad man, and for his previous crimes, if it were possible, he deserved to be hung over and over again. Butler admitted having committed a many great other crimes. He begged me to write to Preston's relatives, expressing to them his deep sorrow of murdering that boy. Butler is also supposed to have murdered a man named Davis, and I asked if that was so. He was somewhat reticent over this murder. He said others were implicated and he did not want to say anything to get them into trouble. Apparently Davis was a 28-year-old that he murdered in Victoria. The consequence of the last statement is that the authorities have come to the conclusion from the murderer's demeanour that Butler was either guilty of the murder of Davis or was implicated in it. Butler made a will yesterday and handed it over to the governor of the jail. Sundry small articles he left to the governor and the deputy governor of the jail, Reverend Lane and the clerk at Darlinghurst. The residue of his property is now in the possession of the police and is left to his sister in England. Who the sister of the murderer is, the authorities declined to say. The Attorney-General states that Butler made no mention of Price, who was supposed to be another of his victims, to the governor of the jail or anyone else. The authorities now know Butler's real name was not Butler or Ash or Newman or any name yet published. They are in possession of his real name and know that his relatives are fairly well-to-do people in England. They are further of the opinion that it would only give them pain and serve no good purpose to publish the facts. All sorts of reports have been circulated regarding Butler's real name. A statement did contain a letter received by a resident of Newcastle from a relative in West Bromwich, Staffordshire, and it seems to bear the imprint of truth. The letter states that Butler's real name is John Newman. He was a native of West Bromwich, and he was said to have 3 brothers in responsible positions. John Newman was regarded from his youth as the black sheep of the family. At an early age he ran away from home and for a considerable period nothing was heard of him. The letter bears out a number of particulars, matching the story told by Butler to newspapers in San Francisco that he had a long experience in naval and military forces of Great Britain. The massive geography of his multiple lives fired a reasonable speculation that there were numberless other victims who might never have been found. Another person who was said to have answered Butler's advertisements was Frank Campbell. He accompanied Butler to Mudgee and was never seen again. The day before his execution, he also confessed to killing another man called Price. When shown a photograph of this person, he agreed that this was him. So it appears that Frank Butler murdered 4 people: Weller, Preston, Burgess and Price, and probably another 3, Davis, Harwood and Campbell, in Australia. He will go down in Australian history as the first serial murderer, but one that is hardly known to anyone. So in the end, his aliases were Frank Butler, Frank Harwood, Frank Horwood, Sampson or Simpson, Clare, Burgess, Lee Weller, Richard Ashe, Richard Asher, James McKnight, George Anderson, Elgin and John Newman. At the time of the Blue Mountains murders, he was in his late 30s, a man of powerful build and confiding personality when he wished, but he was afflicted with an ungovernable temper, great cunning and plausible speech.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.